Should you eat like your grandparents to maintain optimal health? That's a question I've been asking myself for a while because a lot of people believe that, well, most of the health issues we deal with today have been introduced with food choices and the way we make and produce food in the last, I don't know, maybe 100 years or so, maybe 50 years, processed foods, junk foods, PFAS and BPA and all of the things that are now related to less than ideal food and how we store and consume food. And the idea is if you just eat like, people did back in the days, everything is going to be good. Welcome to the Primal Shift podcast. And I thought about how have I been eating when I was a kid and how do my grandparents still eat? I mean, they're now 92 and 93 years old respectively. And how do they eat to maintain reasonable health, And I thought about it a lot. And when I grew up in Austria in the 1980s, no one I knew counted calories or prioritized protein. In fact, we didn't even think much about how food impacted our long-term health. The only obvious connection that I remember between diet and poor health was sugar's effect on teeth. Like, don't eat too much candy, otherwise you're going to get bad teeth. That's the only thing that I remember from back in the days. And looking back, our meals were super high in carbohydrates, from starches and grains and sugars. We ate pasta and potatoes and bread. They were low in fat, relatively speaking, and only moderate in protein. We didn't make sure that protein was the center of every meal like we do now. I had cereal for breakfast. I had, and sugary cereal that is, I had bread for dinner. We had sugary drinks all day. I don't even remember just drinking plain water. There was always something in there, typically a syrup or something. Sometimes mom made it out of elderberries, but it was still loaded with just regular cane sugar or stuff we bought in the store. Yet no one that I knew, there were a few exceptions, but in the grander scheme of things, nobody was overweight or dealing with chronic illness. Now, we had gut issues, my dad and I, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but just overall, specifically from a weight perspective, trying to lose weight or not gaining weight, it wasn't an issue. And in many ways, our eating habits at the time mirrored those of our grandparents. My mom cooked based on how her mom cooked, and she probably cooked, based on how her mom prepared food. And again, I mentioned it before, but my grandparents or my grandfather just turned 92 and my grandmother will be 93 in August. They still live independently, they walk daily, and they still travel on their own. And that's pretty impressive. So wouldn't it make sense to just replicate the way of, their diet, eat like our or my grandparents, and I'll just live as long and healthfully as they do. And that's certainly the belief behind much of the homesteading and ancestral living movements. Grow your own food, bake your own bread like our grandparents did, ditch the processed junk food, which didn't exist at the time. Problem solved. But here's the paradox. If you look around, most of the homesteaders that we follow, they deal with excess weight, so they're overweight to varying degrees. They deal with inflammation, and you can often see it, with skin issues like eczema and stuff and pimples, autoimmune issues and a lot of other things. And I'm like, why is that? If you grow your own food, and you eat how our grandparents ate, you bake your own sourdough bread, you grow your own veggies, you grow your own animals or raise your own animals for food. How is it that many of us are still struggling? Something must have changed between back then and now. And I brought this topic up with my wife the other day while we were walking a ribeye or a German Shepherd, something we do on most mornings. We go for just 45-minute walk and use the time to talk about stuff. And so I brought this up and we came up with a couple of potential factors that might be involved here. And there are by no means, saying that, okay, this is the reason why that is. Those are just things that we could come up with that we thought maybe those are factors that are involved. And, I obviously like to hear then also yours thought on that. If you watch this on a platform that supports comments, by all means, let me know what you think. But the number one thing that we could come up with was
We need to interrupt this episode for a quick shout out to our sponsor OneSkin, because let's be honest, nobody wants the skin cells checking out early. It's called cell senescence, when your cells basically start acting old and sluggish. And OneSkin's OS1 peptide is clinically proven to help slow that down. Plus, it's free of those nasty chemicals you'd rather not have hanging around. If you're ready to give your skin some extra love, head over to oneskin.co, that's ONESKIN.co, and use code MKUMMER for 15% off. Now back to our regular scheduled program before any more cells decide to retire.
Chronic stress. Modern life is a constant loop of have-tos. And that's a huge shift from my childhood, where even during tough times, we lived more in the moment. I do not remember my parents saying all the time, oh, we have to, or I have to. There was a lot of more, and we didn't live, we didn't have an easy life per se. We weren't rich, they were struggling financially at times. We lived a very modest life, but it was still, I think more in the moment. We enjoyed what we were doing, and we didn't think as much about what we'll have to do next or that what we did yesterday, But these days, if I just think about how often I use the words I have to every single day, and if you then add in how often my wife says it, there's a lot of have tos that are constantly going on. And don't get me wrong, I really like what I'm doing. I love what I'm doing, and I'm doing it out of free choice. But even so, there are a lot of things that I perceive as I have to do them, for whatever reason, to make money, to keep customers happy, to, whatever the cases might be. There is a lot of have-tos that I feel like I need to do. There is a lot of noise. There is just a lot of stuff going on every single day that I did not have when I was younger, and that my parents and my grandparents, I would argue, still don't have. They live a slower, less stressful life. And the problem with stress, with chronic stress in particular, is that it drains your body's resources for detoxification, digestion, and healing. It's at the end of the day, and that's something that the founder of Apollo, when I interviewed him, said. He said it's a resource issue. It's a resource allocation issue. Stress, that is. The more stressed you are, the less resources you have for other things that are important to keep you healthy. And stress also makes you more reactive to food you might otherwise tolerate. And I notice this every time I go on vacation. We go to, Mexico quite a bit. And, if I eat there, tacos and have a margarita or whatever, or maybe 2 or sometimes even 3, I respond entirely differently to that as if I had those same foods and drinks here at home, where I'm more stressed and under pressure. So the lack of stress while I'm on vacation has a direct impact on how my body responds to less than ideal food choices. There is no bloating, there is no sluggishness, there is no, negatively impacting sleep. I mean, obviously I can also overdo it on vacation, don't get me wrong, but for the most part, it impacts me significantly less in a negative way. So it's not just what you eat, it's also when you eat it and how stressed you are when you do. And I think that's one of the major factors that just, where you can see the difference between eating something that your grandparents maybe ate, and if you do this today, in your current environment, it affects you differently. The second factor is, I think, that food isn't what it used to be. And what I mean by that is, seeds, for example, have been genetically selected to grow faster and resist herbicides like glyphosate and, resist pests. And there has been a lot of changes. Milk from modern dairy cows contains predominantly A1 casein, and that's a protein linked to inflammation in many people. And historically, cows produced A2 casein, which is better tolerated by the human gut overall. And then at some point, a natural genetic mutation caused the appearance of A1, and then we started selecting for that because those cows who had that defect, so to say, they just happened to produce more milk than other cows. And so it was like humans again not interfered, but selectively then bred something that's less than ideal for us overall. And even, cows in general, they these days produce so much more milk than a calf could ever drink that you have to milk them twice a day. Otherwise, they would get mastitis and ultimately, die a painful death if you don't relieve the pressure, so to say, and milk them twice a day. And those are just two examples, but the bottom line here really is whenever we do something, be it either genetic modification or selective breeding or crossbreeding or hybridization, we change protein structures. And new proteins, the problem with new proteins is that then develop as part of that interaction, interference at the end of the day, they can be identified as invaders by the immune system because it's a new protein that our immune system isn't familiar with. And so we respond with inflammation to it. We think, oh, there's an invader. We need to launch an attack because something is trying to get into our bloodstream that's not supposed to be there. And that causes then issues down the line. And that might be the reason why, eating a sourdough bread, even if it's, made from organic grains, is different to maybe the bread that I had when I was a kid, that I did not respond negatively to as far as I could tell. And so the bottom line really is that the inputs may be familiar, but the outcomes are not. And so those are the two main reasons. But there's a third one, and those really is a culmination of other factors, environmental factors that might be multiplying the effects that we see today. When I was a kid in the 80s, we spent hours and hours outdoors. There were no smartphones or cell phones for that matter. We didn't have Wi-Fi at home. Even our lighting was different. We had warm incandescent bulbs instead of blue spectrum flickering LEDs that we have now that are so prevalent now you can't even get incandescent anymore for the most part. And it's not far-fetched to think that, reduced sunlight by spending more time indoors, increased screen time, disrupted circadian rhythms, and nonstop exposure to man-made EMFs that are now prevalent at levels that we never had before in history, would have an impact on our health and our body's ability to deal with stressors in the sense of, less than ideal food choices and some of the other chronic stressors that we deal with today. Now, here is the interesting thing though, my family in Austria still eats pretty much the same way we did when I was a kid, including my grandparents, and I have a picture here I'm gonna show you. That's from 2012 when my wife and I, we just got married not too long before. We visited them, and if you look at the food on the table, it's a big bread basket. It's corn, it's zucchini, it's beer, it's soda, and there was also some grilled meat. So it was not completely proteinless, and there was a salad in the back, it looks like. But it was very, very, if I were to eat like that every single day, and that's what I do, I would be in different health. My health would be wrecked. I'm sure about this because I've tested it. If I eat sourdough bread more than once a week, I do feel and see the consequences. And so does my wife. So how is it possible that they can do it, but we cannot? And I'm not saying that my family in Austria is in perfect health. Everyone has issues, but at least from a fat accumulation perspective, there is a huge difference between what we see over here in the United States and what we see elsewhere, where life is slower, where food is maybe different, where there are more laws that prevent the messing with, with food, with grains, with, glyphosate and those things, even though, I'm not saying the European Union is perfect because it's certainly not. But there are significantly less toxins in the food supply than it is over here. So what can we do about this? That's really at the end of the day, or do we want to do anything about it, or just continue moving on without doing anything? But at least for us, I think there are things that we can do to mimic to a degree what we had in the past, and mesh it together with a different, more modern life maybe than we have now. Because I told my wife the other day, I said, look, how cool would it be if we didn't have to think about food the way we do today, where like every time we pick something up, we have to look at the label. We have to think about, okay, should I have this second slice of bread, or might it be, counterproductive? We spend so much time thinking about food and how it impacts us and if it's a good choice or a bad choice. it's exhausting for most people, you know, and I think do a little bit better than most people. I'm capable and able to handle those stressors, I think, relatively well. But it's nonetheless a burden that I wish at the end of the day I did not have, and I could just eat how, you know, careless at the end of the day, not irresponsible, but more careless, similar to how I did back in the days growing up in Austria, and how my, you know, family in Austria still does. And so for us, I think what we do and what we've started doing is, you know, to remove ourselves to a degree from that fast-paced life by buying some land in the sticks where life is slower, and, you know, move out there and just enjoy a slower, less stressful life. Because I think the environment plays a major role. If you're in an environment where everyone is hectic, everyone is go, 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 everyone is like, oh, I need to have, I need to buy, I need to do, you know, it's very difficult to not do that. And so by moving out to the country and being closer to the land, you know, being forced by, you know, living in a tiny home, you know, for a while at least, you know, being forced to spend more time outdoors, to cook outside, you know, to be closer to nature. That's another thing that, you know, we did a lot when I was a kid. We spent a lot of time outdoors, you know, except when the weather was terrible, we would be outdoors in whatever shape or form. You know, grow your own food so you really know what's going in there. If you want to, you know, bake your own bread, then, you know, grow your own wheat and make it, you know, ancient grains that have not been modified and hybridized and changed in a way that could be potentially an issue. Because again, when I was a kid, we ate a ton of bread and it was not an issue, you know, and now eating 2 slices a week, you almost feel like, oh, I'm doing something wrong, because I can kind of feel already that it's negatively impacting me. I don't think that's how it's supposed to be, you know. And from a home, again, perspective, you know, live in a maybe a smaller but non or less toxic home, you know. We do, when we are in the process of building a tiny home that's going to have copper piping, you know, for water supply instead of PEX or PVC or whatever, you know, plastic kind that, you know, leaches microplastic and all kinds of crap into the water that you drink every day. So copper piping, you know, which is more affordable if it's a smaller home, because the length of the copper pipe is less, etc. You know, keep the let us not as much natural sunlight in by having a lot of windows, you know, instead of relying on artificial light. You know, stay connected to community, you know, express gratitude and share, you know, what we learn and share what we have with others, so they can hopefully pick up on that as well. And as always, you know, it's not about perfection, because that doesn't exist. I cannot wind back and live exactly that, you know, with everything we had when I was a kid. That's not impossible. I live in a different country, different environment, but I can at least try to cut out and mitigate some of those major factors that we have identified and that we believe are at the root of what's going on today. And, you know, it's about peeling back those individual layers and just removing what no longer serves us. And I think the hectic life is one of the things that no longer serves us. Stress is a killer, and it's not a silent one. And I just want to, you know, live peacefully, not having to think about every single choice I make, whether it's healthy or not. I just want to be in an environment where making an unhealthy choice is incredibly difficult, like it was back in the days, without having to obsess about every single bite and every single biohack. And with that, we're gonna wrap it up. Again, if you watch this on a platform that supports comments, you know, let me know what you think. What do you think are the factors that make it so difficult to, even for those that have a reasonably healthy diet and still have issues losing weight, or gain weight and don't know exactly why? You know, let me know. I'd like to hear from you, or just shoot me an email and let me know if you're listening to this maybe on a platform that doesn't support comments, and hope I'll see you in the next episode.